Welcome, ladies and gentlemen, to the lesson. In today's class, we're going to wind up the topic public sector procurement. In our previous sessions, we've covered introduction to procurement, storekeeping, and legal and institutional framework in public sector procurement. We've done the general principles in procurement. We described the procurement cycle in public institutions. We looked at the accountable documents applied in public procurement. We highlighted the roles and relationship between stores personnel, procurement, and supply chain officer in public entity. We studied the establishment of Public Procurement Regulatory Authority, the PPRA, as public procurement regulator. Today we're going to look at the public procurement partnership models. That is the end. That will be the end of this topic, public sector procurement. The last lesson is public-private partnership models. By the end of this lesson, you should be able to explain the public-private procurement, public-private models, public-private partnership models. By now, I know you know what a public-private partnership is. It is defined as a long-term contract between a private party and a government entity for providing a public asset or service in which the private party bears significant risk and management responsibility, and remuneration is linked to performance. Do you understand? It's a contract. The PPP is a contract between a public entity and a private party. It's a contract for doing what? For providing a public asset or service in which the private party bears significant risk and management responsibility. Then remuneration, in other words, this private party is paid according to performance. And candidates, the PPPs combine the deployment of private sector capital and sometimes public sector capital to improve public services or the management of public sector assets. And by focusing on public outputs, they offer a more sophisticated and cost-effective approach to the management of risk by public sector than is generally achieved by the traditional input-based public sector procurement. So PPP is an arrangement where the private sector is incorporated into delivery of public services. And there are a wide range or spectrum of models. That's our today's focus. All right? There are models which vary mainly on the basis of ownership of capital assets. They also vary on the basis of responsibility for investment. The variation of these models is as well on the basis of assumption of risks. They also vary based on the duration of contract and so on. And they are broadly classified into 5 categories. The first one being, the first category of PPP model is the supply and management contracts. Supply and management contracts. supply and management contracts. Then the second one is what we call the turnkey contracts. Turnkey contracts. Turnkey contracts. Turnkey contracts. Turnkey contracts. The third model is known as the affirmage. Affirmage stroke lease. Affirmage and lease. Concessions. Number 4. Concessions. Then lastly is what is referred to as the private finance initiative. Private finance initiative. These are 5 broad categories of PPP models. Categories of PPP models. Let's first discuss supply and management contracts. Supply and management contracts. What is a management contract? Now, a management contract is a contractual arrangement for the management of a part or a whole of a public enterprise. All right? You may have an example of a specialized port terminal for container handling, a port or a utility. So it is a contract or a contractual arrangement for the management of a part or a whole of a public enterprise by the private sector. Management what? Contract. As the name suggests, management contracts. The private sector manages an enterprise in part or wholly. And management contracts allow private sector skills to be brought into service design and delivery, as well as operational control, labor management, and equipment procurement. So the private sector is allowed to bring in the skills, the expertise into service design and delivery. Designing of services and delivering of services, as well as operations. Okay, the skills and expertise in private sector are now allowed to come into the operations of government, the management of labor, and even the procurement of equipment. However, the public sector retains the ownership of the facility and equipment. So it's just a contract where the private sector manages an enterprise, but that enterprise is still owned by the public sector or by the government. The private sector is just assigned specified responsibilities concerning a service and is generally not asked to assume commercial risk. The private contractor is paid a fee to manage and operate services. And normally the payment of such fees is performance-based. If the private sector performs according to the expectations, then it's paid. If not, then it's not paid. And usually the contract period is just short, typically 3 to, say, 5 years. But the period may be longer for large and complex operational facilities, such as the management of an airport or management of a port and so on. So do you understand? Management contracts. So such an arrangement has pros and cons. Pros. Let's discuss the pros or the benefits. Pros. Pros. What are the benefits or the advantages? What are the advantages of management contracts? Number one, obvious, is that it can be implemented in a short period of time. Could be 2 years, 3 years, short period of time, 5 years. That is one. Number two, compared to these other models, it is least complex. It is a least complex model. As we'll be studying these other ones, you will see the complexity, the level of complexity. The management contracts are least complex of all the PPP models. I had mentioned period can be accomplished in short period of time. Another advantage of a management contract is that in some countries, politically and it could be politically acceptable and also socially acceptable for certain projects like the water projects, the strategic projects like the ports and like airports and so on. Politically and socially. Like here in Kenya, if you are to say you want to privatize the port, that may not be politically acceptable. It may not be socially acceptable because it's more of people view it as a government entity, government owned. So in a management contract, we saw that the private party only manages a part or the whole of it, but the government retains the ownership of the utility or the facility. The public sector retains the ownership of the facility. So given that the government retains the ownership of the facility, then it may be socially and politically acceptable. The politicians and the people, politicians and the society can easily accept a management contract as compared to these other type of models. Now, what are the cons? These are the advantages. How about the disadvantages? Now, one obvious disadvantage is that efficiency gains may be limited because there is little incentive for the private party. Little efficiency gains because it's just a contract, it's a short contract, so there is not much incentive on the part of the private party to take up such a project. Efficiency gains may be limited and little incentive. There is little incentive for the private sector to invest. And we saw that risks borne by the public sector. We are looking at the pros and cons from the aspect of the public sector. The public sector or the government invites the private parties but the government bears all the risks. So that is a disadvantage. Almost all risks are borne by the government. Yet another disadvantage is that such an arrangement is only possible for existing in structure. Because it's a contract between the public sector and the private sector for the private sector to manage part or whole of a public enterprise which is already existing. So this arrangement cannot work where a new infrastructure is required or facility. So that's a limitation. So that's all we can say about supply and management contracts. We've described what the contract is all about. We've outlined the 3 advantages and 3 disadvantages. B, turnkey contracts. Turnkey contracts. Turnkey contracts candidates is a traditional public sector procurement model for infrastructure facilities. And generally, a private contractor is selected through a bidding process. The private sector contractor then designs and builds a facility for a fixed fee. Designs and builds. Designs and builds. So through a bidding process, a contractor is identified. The private contractor then designs the facility, then builds it for a fixed fee. At a fixed fee, a contractor is a private contractor is selected through a bidding process. Then the private contractor designs and builds the facility. Do you understand? The private sector, private contractor, I repeat, designs and builds a facility for a fixed fee. For example, it could be, it can also be a fixed fee or rate or a total cost, which is one of the key criteria in selecting the winning bid. So there could be many bidders, then one is selected based on the total cost that the private contractor will promises to charge, which is one of the criteria in winning a bid. And therefore, the private contractor assumes risks involved in the design and the construction phases of the facility or the project. And the scale of investment by the private sector is generally low and for a short term. The scale of what? Of investment. And typically, in this type of arrangement, there is no strong incentive for early completion of the project. So this type of private sector participation is what is known as design and build. So what are the pros? What are the advantages of this model? Number one, this model is well understood. because it's a model that has been used for many years. It is a traditional public sector procurement model for infrastructure facilities, traditional. It is well understood, traditional model. And another advantage is that the contract agreement, not complex. The contract, the agreement between the public sector and the private contractor is not complex. It's not complex. Yet another advantage is that generally contract enforcement is not a major issue. Enforcement easy. Enforcement is easy. It's not an issue. But this one also comes with some drawbacks. What are the drawbacks? The first obvious one is that the private sector has no strong incentive for early completion. No strong incentive for early completion. No, there is no strong incentive for early completion. Another point is that all risks, except those in the construction and installation phase, are borne by the public sector. Some risks borne by the public. Apart from the design risks and the early construction risks, the rest of the risks are borne by the public sector. That's a disadvantage. Then lastly, there is low private investment for a limited period. Low private investment for a limited period. Low private investment for a limited period. Low private investment for limited period. There are other disadvantages, like only limited innovation may be possible. Limited innovation. But let's move on to the next model. The third model, affirmage. Stockley's model. Affirmage Stockley's model. Now, in this category of arrangement, the operator, who is the leaseholder, is responsible for operating and maintaining the infrastructure facility that already exists and services. But generally, the operator is not required to make any large investment. However, often this model is applied in combination with other models, such as build, rehabilitate, operate, transfer. And in such a case, the contract period is generally much longer than the private sector is required, is generally longer. All right? The contract period is generally much longer, and the private sector is required to make significant investment. It's longer. It's not like the management contract, which we saw is shorter. And the difference between them is the technical. Under a lease candidates, the operator retains revenue collected from customers of the facility and makes a specified lease fee payment to the contracting authority or to the public sector. So after managing the facility, the people who pay for the facility, the revenues that are received from the payment from the customers, those revenues are retained by the private sector. But the private sector is required to make specified lease fee payment to the public sector. That is lease. But under an affirmage, the operator and the contracting authority share revenue from customers. Do you understand? So that's the difference. Under lease, the private sector retains all the revenues, but pays a fixed lease fee to the government or to the contracting entity. Under affirmage, the revenues received from customers are shared between the private sector and the public sector. And in the affirmage lease types of arrangements, the operator takes lease of both infrastructure and equipment from the government for an agreed period of time. The operator does what? Takes lease of both infrastructure and equipment. Both infrastructure and equipment from the government for an agreed period of time. And generally, the government undertakes the responsibility for investment and thus bears investment risks. But operational risks are transferred to the operator or the private sector. However, as part of the lease, some assets also may be transferred on a permanent basis for a period which extends over the economic life of assets. But fixed facilities like land are leased out for a longer period than for mobile assets. And the land to be developed by the leaseholder is usually transferred for longer periods, like 15 years, 20 years, 30 years, and so on. So what are the pros? The advantages: one, can be implemented in a short period, can be implemented in a short period of time. Number two, significant private investment possible. Period of time. Significant private investment possible because these are longer periods. We saw in the, for example, the management contracts, there is little investment required from the private because they come in to manage existing infrastructure. In some countries, legally, and this kind of a model is legally and politically more acceptable. Legally and politically acceptable for more strategic projects. like ports. It could be acceptable because of that lease. Ownership is not wholly transferred. Ownership is not transferred to the private sector. So it could be legally and politically acceptable. It could also be socially acceptable. Drawbacks: has little incentive, has little incentive. It has little incentive for the private sector to invest, particularly if the lease period is short. Risks borne by the public sector. Risks are borne by the public sector. Almost all risks are borne by the public sector. It is also generally used for existing infrastructure assets. Generally used for existing assets. Number 4, there may be need to have regulatory oversight. Regulatory oversight required. There may be need for considerable regulatory oversight because of the legal implications of this kind of arrangement. So that's all as far as affirmage is concerned. And then we move on to part D, concessions. Concessions. Now, in this form of PPP arrangement, the government defines and grants specific rights to an entity. The government does what? Defines and grants specific rights to an entity, usually a private company, to build and operate a facility for a fixed period of time. The government may retain the ultimate ownership of the facility and the right to supply the services. Now, in concessions, payments can take place both ways. The concessionaire pays to the government for the concession rights, and the government may pay the concessionaire, which it provides under the agreement to meet certain specific conditions. And usually, such payments by the government may be necessary to make projects commercially viable or to reduce the level of commercial risk undertaken by the private sector or company, particularly in a developing or untested PPP market. And typical concessions period range between 10 to 50 years, could be less than 10, but we see it's a very long period of time, 50 years. So that's concessions. And by the description of it, we can easily identify pros. What are the advantages? Here, private sector bears a significant share of risks. As compared to the other models, which is good to the public sector. There is also high level of investment. There is a high level of investment by the private sector. Because the private sector builds and operates the facility for a fixed period of time. So there is high level of investment by the private sector. High level of private investment. Then number 3 is a potential for efficiency gains in all phases of the project. Potential for efficiency gains in all phases of the project. All phases. Okay? All phases. Not like the other models where we saw there is a potential for efficiency maybe at the beginning. Okay? At the beginning. Potential for efficiency gains in all phases of project development and also implementation, as well as technological innovation. Technological innovation is also high. Cons, almost wrote scones, but it is cons. Cons, the drawbacks. Cons. These are highly complex projects to implement and administer. Highly complex. They are highly complex to implement and administer or manage. They may run up to 50 years. Such projects are complex. Difficult to implement in untested PPP markets. In new PPP markets, such projects can be difficult to implement. Difficult to implement in an untested PPP market. May also have underlying, these projects may have underlying fiscal risks or costs to the government. The projects may take long time to negotiate. So another, the negotiation between the government and the private sector may take long time to negotiate. The negotiation between the government and the private sector may take too long when dealing with concessions. Yet another obvious drawback of this model is that this model may require close regulatory oversight. Close regulatory oversight necessary or required. These are disadvantages. There are also contingent liabilities on government, in the medium term and long term. In the medium term and the long term, that government may have to incur contingent liabilities. So these are the pros and cons of concessions. Concessions. You've done management contracts, turnkey contracts, after-marriage and lease concessions. Then let's have a look at the private finance initiative. Private finance initiative, that is E. Private finance initiative. Now, in the private finance initiative model, the private sector remains responsible for the design, construction, and operation. Responsible for design, construction, and operation. The private sector is responsible for designing the project, constructing the project, and operating the project. It's almost all the phases. It remains responsible for the design, construction, and operation of an infrastructure facility. And in some cases, the public sector may relinquish the right of ownership of assets. Public sector may relinquish right of ownership. This is not the case with the other models. The other models, the government retains the ownership regardless of the nature of the contract. But here, in some cases, the private sector may relinquish the right of ownership of assets to the private sector. And in this model, the private sector purchases infrastructure services from the private sector through a long-term agreement. Do you understand? The public sector does what? Purchases infrastructure services from the private sector through a long-term agreement. Private finance initiative, sometimes referred to as the PFI. PFI projects. PFI. Now, the PFI projects, therefore, bear direct financial obligations to the government in any event. In addition, explicit and implicit contingent liabilities may also arise due to loan guarantees provided to the lenders and also the default of public or private entity on non-guaranteed loans. So a PFI project can be structured on minimum payment by the government over a fixed contract tenure or minimum contract tenure for a fixed annual payment, or a combination of both payment and tenure. So in the PFI model, asset ownership at the end of the contract period is generally transferred to the public sector. And setting up of what we call an SPV, setting up of an SPV, which is a special vehicle, a special purpose vehicle, may be always necessary. So a PFI contract may be awarded to an existing company. And for the purpose of financing, the lenders may, however, require the establishment of a special purpose vehicle. And this kind of model has many variants. And in a PFI project, as the same entity builds and operates the services and is paid for the successful supply of services at a predefined standard, the special purpose vehicle has no incentive to reduce the quality or the quantity of services. So, candidates, this form of contractual arrangement reduces the risks of cost overruns during the design and also the construction phases, or of choosing an efficient technology, since the operator's future earnings depend on controlling the costs. So the public sector's main advantage lie in the relief from bearing the cost of design and construction, and also the transfer of certain risks to the private sector and the promise of better project design, construction, and operation. So what are the main pros? What are the main advantages? Of course, looking at the other models, the first pro or advantage will be in relation to the risks. The private sector bears significant. The private sector bears significant share of risks. There is also high level of private investment. It's high level of private investment, because you've seen here that the private sector or company designs, constructs, and operates, so bears high level of investment. Another advantage is in relation to the efficiency gains. There is potential for efficiency gains. Potential for efficiency gains is very high. Potential for efficiency gains is high, including innovation. Innovation gains is also high. This kind of model is attractive to the private sector. This is what the private sector likes. You've seen here the public sector may relinquish right of ownership. Assets owned by the government may be, the right to own such assets are relinquished to the private sector, and that's very attractive to private investors in an untested or developing PPP market. It's most suitable for social sector infrastructure projects. more suitable for what? It's more suitable for social sector infrastructure projects like schools, like dormitories, we have hospitals, communities, and so on. Disadvantages? Complex to implement. Not any company can implement this, or arrangement between the government and not be able to implement. It's not easy to implement and manage the contractual regimes. The government in private finance initiative has direct what we call financial liability. Direct financial. The government has direct financial liability. Negotiations between the private sector and the public sector may take too long. They may take too long because this is a contractual arrangement that is required to take a period of 50 years or 30 years, 20 years. So negotiations may take too long before the agreement is reached. Then there is a question on regulation. Regulatory efficiency is very important. Is necessary and important. Regulatory efficiency. Contingent liabilities on the government. Contingent liabilities on the government. That is in the medium and in the long term. So these are the public-private partnership models. And a question that one may ask, which model should be selected? The answer to such a question may need careful assessment of many things, because each model, as we have seen, has its own pros and cons and can be suitable for achieving the major objectives of private, public-private partnership to a varying degree. So candidates, there are various factors to be considered in selecting the appropriate public-private partnership model. There could be factors like the technological development, the legal and regulatory regimes, the public or the political perception about the services in a sector, and so on. So when asked what are the factors to be considered when selecting a public-private partnership model, there you have the answer. So there ought to be careful assessment of many factors. Why? Because each model has its own merits and demerits. And each model can be suitable for achieving major objectives of public-private partnership to a varying degree. So there are factors to consider like the technological development, the regulatory regimes, the legal regimes, the perception that the society may have, the perception of the politicians, the public perception about the services in a sector, and so on. So do you understand? We've come to the end of the lesson. What are we studying today? We were studying the public-private partnership models. All right? These are models. So candidates, we started this lesson by defining PPP. And we said that public-private partnership is defined as a long-term contract between private party and government entity. Is a contract between the two, public entity and private entity. And what is the contract all about? The contract is about providing a public asset or service in which the private party bears significant risk and management responsibility. And remuneration is linked to performance. So that's the meaning of PPP, public-private partnership. But the focus of our today's lesson was on the models, PPP models. And before I listed the models, I said that there are a wide range or spectrum of PPP models today. And these models vary mainly on the basis of ownership of capital assets. The models vary, number 2, on responsibility for investment. Number 3, the models vary on assumption of risks. And number 4, the variation is on the basis of duration of the contract. So we listed 5 models. Supply and management contracts, number 1. Turnkey contracts, number 2. Affirmage and lease, number 3. Concessions, number 4. Then private finance, number 5. I've gone ahead to describe all the 5 models. And in describing these models, you may have realized that the features in all the 5 models, the features are based on ownership, responsibility for investment, assumption of risk, and duration of contract. So candidates, you don't need to cram these things, but you need to just get understanding when describing the supply and management contracts. When you look at the pros and cons, they are just based on the 4. Ownership of capital. In a management contracts model, who owns the capital assets? We saw here it's the government, the private sector. Because in a management contract, the private party comes in to just manage, because it's a management contract, to manage the facility, to manage the infrastructure on behalf of the government. That's why we said here, one advantage is that it's least complex. The contract takes a short period of time. The contract also said is socially and politically acceptable, especially for strategic infrastructure facilities. For example, in managing, say, a port or an airport, the members of the public may not have a problem having a management contracts, because the ownership of the capital assets are not transferred to the private party. All right? So all these models, they vary on the basis, I repeat, of number 1, ownership of capital assets. Number 2, responsibility of investment. Number 3, assumption of risk. Number 4, the duration of the contract. This one takes a very short period of time, the first one. The long term, this could be 2 years, could be 1 year or 3 years or 5 years and less. But the private finance initiative, the PFI, could take 50 years. So I deliberately organized the models in an order, the order of complexity of the projects, all right, or the models. This one is more complex than this one. Affirmage is more complex than the turnkey contracts. We said the turnkey contracts are the traditional form of arrangement. Turnkey, design and build for a fixed period of time. It's a traditional kind of model, arrangement between the public sector and the private sector. So the affirmage stock lease is more complex than the turnkey. Concessions more complex than this one. Then we have the PFI more complex than. So I arrange them that order so that you can easily relate, because we say we learn through repetition and also through correlation. So you should be able to correlate. As we build, you should correlate. So we've studied the pros and cons. The pros for management contracts: least complex, takes short period of time, socially and politically acceptable. Disadvantage: lead to efficiency gains. Risks are borne by the public sector. Existing infrastructure. Okay? The private sector comes in to manage the existing infrastructure. So they will lead to investment. Okay? Turnkey projects, design and build for a fixed period of time. This one is well understood. It's a traditional model. It's well understood. It's not complex. It's easy to enforce. Enforcement is easy. Regulatory efficiency is not necessary. The disadvantages: no incentive for early completion. Okay? Some risks are borne by the public sector. So you can see here, all risks here are borne by the public sector. All. But in the second one, some risks are borne by the public sector. Then there is low private investment from all right, low private investment. Low private investment. Not much investment is required from the private. Then affirmage stock lease can be implemented in a short period of time. That's an advantage. Significant risks. Significant private investment is possible. Significant. Here it is not, it's low, but here it's significant. See how we are building? Legally and politically acceptable for strategic projects. Disadvantage: has little incentive for the private sector. Risk borne by the private sector. Generally used for existing projects. Regulatory oversight required, because we are talking of lease. These are legal matters that may require regulatory oversight. Concessions: private sector bears significant share of risks. High level of investment by the private sector. High level of investment. All right? High level. This is just significant. This is high level. All right? Potential for efficiency gains in all phases. In all phases. We saw that there was potential for efficiency gains in some phases, like the turnkey projects. Disadvantages: highly complex to implement and administer. Highly complex. Difficult to implement in untested PPI markets. Number 3, underlying fiscal risks. Then number 4, loans take too long to negotiate. It takes too long. Takes too long to negotiate between the private sector and the public sector. Close regulatory oversight necessary. Then there are contingency liabilities for the government in the long and short terms. Moving on to PFI. In PFI model, the private sector is required to design, to construct, and to operate. The public sector may relinquish right of ownership. This is a feature that does not appear anywhere in the other four models. Advantages. Private sector bears significant risks. In fact, almost all the risks. Then high level of private investment required. Potential for efficiency gain is also high, as well as innovation gain high. Attractive to private sector. We saw why it's attractive to private sector. The fact that the government relinquishes right of ownership, that is very attractive. More suitable for social sector infrastructure projects like hospitals, schools, community facilities, and so on. But it also comes with disadvantages. Number one, complex to implement. Number two, government has direct financial ability. Number three, negotiations may take too long. Number four, regulatory efficiency is necessary. And lastly, contingent liabilities on the government in the short term and in the long term. And that marks the end of the lesson, PPP models. Assignment. 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 Discuss 5 public-private partnership models. Discuss. Discussing, make sure you outline the features of each model, the advantages of each model, the disadvantages of each model. And when discussing, try and do so without referring to the notes or to the video. In case you find yourself not able to discuss the 5 public-private partnership models, you can refer to the notes, then close the book, do it again. If you get it right, then you are okay. But after 2 to 3 days, try and see if you can recall. And you realize that you may not recall everything, go back to the notes. Close your book. Try and discuss the 5 public-private partnership models without referring to the book. You may find you get it right. But after 1 week, when you try to discuss the 5 public-private partnership models, find you may not be able to do it. So that going back and forth, that's how we learn. All right? That's how we learn. The more you do it, the more the knowledge is embedded in your memory. You practice what we call recall. Practicing to recall what you have learned without referring to the notes. When you do it 2 to 3 times, then you find that you are able to master the subject. Thank you. God bless you. Bye.